on strategy in general. Elements of strategy. The strategic elements that affect the use of engagements may be classified into various types: morale, physical, mathematical, geographical, and statistical. The first type covers everything that is created by intellectual and psychological qualities and influences. The second consists of the size of the armed forces, their composition, armament, and so forth. The third includes the angle of lines of operation, the convergent and divergent movements wherever geometry enters into their calculation. The fourth comprises the influence of terrain, such as commanding positions, mountains, rivers, woods, and roads, and finally the fifth covers support and maintenance. A brief consideration of each of these various types will clarify our ideas and, in passing, assess the relative value of each. Indeed, if they are studied separately, some will automatically be stripped of their undue importance. For instance, it immediately becomes clear that the value of the base of operations, even if we take this in its simplest form as meaning a baseline, depends less on its geometric forms than on the nature of the roads and the terrain through which they run. It would, however, be disastrous to try to develop our understanding of strategy by analysing these factors in isolation, since they are usually interconnected in each military action in manifold and intricate ways. A dreary analytical labyrinth would result, a nightmare in which one tried in vain to bridge the gulf between this abstract basis and the facts of life. Heaven protect the theorist from such an undertaking. For our part, we shall continue to examine the picture as a whole, and take our analysis no further than is necessary in each case to elucidate the idea we wish to convey, which will always have its origins in the impressions made by the sum total of the phenomena of war, rather than in speculative study. That's it. That's the chapter on elements of strategy. Again, I mean, it's compelling reading because it just seems to sort of really, again and again, try to focus on the fundamentals, and I think that's just something that's just so missing in a lot of modern thought. You know, I mean, the last paragraph is probably the most interesting. It would, however, be disastrous to try to develop our understanding of strategy by analysing these factors in isolation, which is something that a lot of people try to do. You know, even rules in war games, you know, sort of do that. All of a sudden, the movement is exactly as it is, since they're usually interconnected in each military action in manifold and intricate ways. You know, I mean, I don't want to say anything exact or specific because it is fairly complex and broad-reaching, but you know, even just saying things like a route, you know, to move down a road costs this much. Well, not all roads are exactly the same. You know, for example, in the hex games, a road that goes up a hill will be probably easier to, will probably be slower to, you know, travel across than a road that goes down a hill, etc., etc. I mean, these are really obvious, but you know, the rules essentially simplify it. You know, in the way that this is sort of trying to warn of. A dreary analytical labyrinth would result, a nightmare of which one tried in vain to bridge the gulf between the abstract basis and the facts of life. You know, I mean, I think we accept the abstract, but I think when you accept the abstract, you have to embrace the abstract as well. And what I mean by that is, when I see a lot of games, they just try so far to integrate what we call here the facts of life, the reality, into the abstract form of the game mechanics. And you know, what I've done in Warblog essentially through and through is to almost embrace the abstract. Now, it has been a bit of a default process. In fact, it wasn't necessarily an actual choice. But for example, the time scale and the physical scale is abstract. I can have one game where units are moving three movement points because they're infantry along a road, and they move 3 hexes. Well, if you look at it physically on a map, the distance they might have covered in one scenario might be 2 miles. In another scenario, it might be 40 miles. It's the abstract nature. There's no sort of determined distance. And I keep it abstract because we can allow and accept that abstract nature without really trying to force these abstract constraints onto the reality of the situation. And similarly with time, some of these scenarios can encompass, say, 6 months. I think there's a couple that are over a year, and yet you play them within 20 turns, and we're saying, well, each turn's a week. Well, they can move as far in a week then as they can in another game where, for example, the recent game we played, which I think was this one, which took 4 hours. We got all the way over there in 4 hours, whereas I really don't know what a good example is going to be in this setup, in these sort of list of games. I think this one took place over a month. It doesn't say the dates, but I'm pretty sure that these. I've actually started to try and at least write the dates in there, but I think this took place over a month. And so, each turn is sort of like, 2 or 3 days. So there's no match up there. So basically, just sort of following back onto, what this is saying, it's talking about a dreary analytical labyrinth would result, a nightmare of which one tried in vain to bridge the gulf between the abstract basis and the facts of life. Heaven protect the theorists from such an undertaking. For our part, we shall continue to examine the picture as a whole, and take our analysis no further than necessary in each case to elucidate the idea we wish to convey, which will always have its origin in the impressions made by the sum total of the phenomena of war rather than in speculative study. It makes an interesting read. I don't think I can really draw too much from that last part, but I think overall, it just preaches common sense, really. It does. One of the things I find really quite interesting about this sort of text is that it provides words and terms and senses for things that I haven't really sort of heard before. I mean, especially when you play war games and you look at a lot of war games and a lot of other gaming systems, they have a lot of very specific things that almost detract from what is actually happening. I mean, a zone of control, for example, is a very specific thing, and it's just a game mechanism. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that in any way, but this is sort of introducing terms that I've not really come across before. And I was thinking about this, and this is the chapter over, so I'm just warbling now. But it describes the phenomenon of war. And I think I touched on that concept right at the very beginning when I started doing this site, is putting a sort of a title of what war is, and I called it I think it sort of the topic or the discipline or the subject, and he calls it here the phenomenon of war. I mean, it is a phenomenon that is sort of abstract from what war actually is. In the sense that you can then actually sort of study it and analyse it and consider it as a sort of separate entity that is, I wouldn't say greater than the sum parts of the total of its sum parts, but it's a different animal from the sum of its parts. And a lot of people say, oh, you can't talk like that. What I'm talking about is in reference to, say, sort of being abstract away from the humanistic elements of war, and which you can. But you might sort of say, well, that's it's quite cruel. But you can actually look at war, and this is how I tend to look at it when you're looking at all these little counters and things, one of the things that it's not so much appeals to me, but I'm very much aware of, is there's no sort of reference to human beings in any of this. There's no sort of, well, if I do this many people are going to be permanently injured for the rest of their lives. And we're dealing with and toying with the phenomenon of war, as it puts it here, which is quite. I mean, this is not what it's saying, but it is a different being from built from the sum total of its parts, to being a phenomenon that can be sort of examined and explored without necessarily sort of analysing its very basic constructs. For example, I mean, one of the things I often consider when in all of these sorts of engagements is a fist fight. There's not a lot of difference. I mean, this person here has chosen his ground, and the North Koreans or South Chinese, or whoever they are, the Chinese, 40th Group Army. They're walking over to sort of punch this person in the face. It's not quite as simple as that, but a lot of things that happen in war are, the parallels are extensive, and war is, just because you might fight it with drones and aircraft and indirect area fire and chemical weapons and all the sorts of things, at the end of the day, there's not a lot of difference between doing that and say punching someone in the face. You're causing them physical pain, but the risk is a lot higher to you. But then again, there's not as much risk of you just sort of being punched in the face without really knowing that it might be about to happen, which could very well happen if you're underneath a sudden rocket strike. There's not much you can do about that. But the two different sort of extremes of conflict are still sort of basically the same thing. They're just at different scales. The other thing that this sort of talks about is the elements of strategy. In the first paragraph, it says that the strategic elements that affect the use of engagements may be classified into various types. It says morale, physical, mathematical, geographical, and statistical. And I think that's, again, something that is, that I like quite enjoying about this read, is that it starts talking about some of these more abstract concepts. I mean, these are not particularly abstract. I'm just talking about morale, and that's, the first type covers everything that is created by the intellectual and psychological qualities and influences. And I think most people would know what morale is really all about. Physical, most people would know that. Mathematical, and this is something that is real. There are mathematical considerations, and I think a lot of sort of modern conception about war would really like to rule out the mathematical side of things because it dehumanises things. The geographical would probably be something that people would consider, but again, it's sort of it's a very sort of specific sort of category in its own right. So you can sort of look at the difference between the geography of, say, the Middle East and the geography of Vietnam, which is just jungle and paddy fields, and it's very different to sort of the sort of warfare that you would have in the in the Middle East. But these are not the real sort of the real things that I was trying to get to. That's just the starting point. What I'm really trying to get to are, as you read through this book, and I'm just going to skip through to some of these other elements. I'm not going to talk about them in depth, but it brings across other sort of terms. For example, moral factors, the principal moral elements. These are chapter titles. The military virtues of the army, and so a lot of gaming people design games that don't necessarily take in the concept of virtues. Now you get that in a lot of these little war games on computers, where you can build up as basically the virtue of an army. I think they call it prestige. It becomes a factor. The more prestigious your unit becomes through battle, historically, the greater its fighting, capability to some extent. But it's got other things like boldness, and I just think, oh, hang on. I mean, when was a game that included boldness? They've all gone down the same track where they've got morale, They've got degrees of proficiency, for example, green, raw, experienced, elite, etc., etc. But the concept of boldness, where you could integrate that in other ways, but it suddenly becomes, well, this is a title heading that we're going to be discussing, and it's 3 pages, so it's quite significant. And this is one that I was thinking about today in particular, perseverance. Now that's only a 1-page chapter, but the concept of perseverance in war, and how does that work, and how does that apply? And suddenly you get all these terms and words and concepts that you could sort of say, well, how does that actually work in what we're thinking? And again, this is written, it's got to be over 100, over 100 years old, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, even 200 years ago. And these concepts have still got to be the same, the perseverance. And I don't want to sort of go too much into that, because I'm looking forward to actually discussing that chapter. But perseverance, as a quality in war, strikes to me as being, a particularly interesting sort of facet of discussion, really. It's got another one here, superiority of numbers. Now, some of these things have actually changed quite a lot, and one of the things that I did sort of think about after recording the initial audios that I've done were how things have changed since this person, Clautz, whatever his name is, wrote this. It is very much based on national sort of what you might call, well, basically traditional warfare, synchronous warfare, where you've got 2 armies fighting each other, and it doesn't really. I'm thinking, well, how can you apply this to modern warfare, which is more asynchronous? Do the same sorts of things work? Does strategy work? In the same way. How do these terms actually work? For example, perseverance could be something that a terrorist or a sort of militant organisation in civil war could bring to their benefit by just persevering for so long that they defeat the government. But similarly, the government could persevere against a rebel force. So it's not something that would happen one way or another, but perseverance could be something that's fairly key, whilst superiority in numbers, which is the next chapter, would be, well, clearly the superiority in numbers would go with the government force, but it wouldn't necessarily mean they would win, etc., etc. We've got one here, surprise, and quite often war games do have the element of surprise in them. Quite often you'll roll for initiative, and it's an interesting concept. I wouldn't apply it in Warblog, because it just becomes a little more complex. And again, a lot of these things I wouldn't incorporate, but I think they're worth bearing in mind. In many of these scenarios, the concept of surprise was key to what actually happened, and you can't necessarily sort of actually define how surprise works. There is one in here, and I don't think I'm going to be able to find it. I think it might be this one, actually. They were trying to basically surprise these forces, and they were spotted a lot earlier on. I don't think it is actually this one. It's one that goes sort of left to right. Yes, this is it. The Battle of Garipur, Bangladesh. Basically, the Indian forces did actually intend to surprise the Pakistani forces, but they didn't, because there were patrols that they ran across, and they lost the element of surprise. And they still came out with the upper hand. But again, things like surprise, it's quite difficult to actually model that. And again, by taking the abstract sort of approach to games and embracing it, as opposed to trying to hard rule in rules for surprise, it does you can sort of incorporate those sorts of elements in there. For example, you could say, okay, well, we've got some surprise, and then say, well, to reflect that, Windows not going to move this way because we're surprised, and then you just role play it, and then it's job done, so to speak. But alternatively, you could sort of say, well, okay, well, for the first 3 turns we've got surprise, so we're going to have a plus 20% on. I mean, in this case, the only thing we could really put that to is combat. But would that actually help with these ones? It just becomes a lot more bogged down, and I think the key thing from my point of view as to why that wouldn't work really is because you can't visualize that, and that's one thing that's key for me in the way these works. I mean, it's your understanding that's important, not the sort of the technical aspects of reflecting or modelling or simulating those concepts. So you have to be aware of the surprise that was in the elements of surprise and how they worked in this battle in order to appreciate them, and that's not going to be achieved by rule mechanics. It's going to be achieved by you reading and understanding the material that's in the background. In this case, on the Wikipedia article, and that's what how that works. But other things in here, but he's got a few pages on surprise, and this one that particularly got me. And I think the thing that's sort of appealing to me more are the things that I've not heard before. For example, surprise. Yeah, okay, that's got some really interesting elements and angles to it, but I've heard it before. It's been done, and it's quite it's quite a well used concept. But this is my sort of, not so much angst, but one of the things that I'm angling at other games, and it's not really supposed to be a sort of a full on criticism of other games, but they've modelled one thing but not the other. So a lot of games have surprise, but what about this next section? It's called cunning. How do you modify that? And this is what I was thinking. Cunning. Oh, that sounds really good. I mean, what's that going to be about? I'm not even going to read the first bit out because I want to get to that chapter and go through it. But all of a sudden, this whole narrative is going to introduce these new sort of terms that you can batter around. And to be quite honest, I've got a whole ton of these sorts of books, and so I could do a lot of reading. I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent doing lots of reading, but I think it's it's quite a good mental exercise. Concentration of forces in space. Now, again, I think that's something that would be very much more focused on synchronous warfare, traditional warfare, and you'd sort of think, well, how could we do that against an asynchronous, militant, irregular force? And again, you've got to consider these things, but that doesn't appeal to me so much. But I think, just thinking about that, well, concentration of forces in space, what's that going to be about, and how's that going to be sort of reflected in the games that we're looking at? Unification of forces in time. One of the things that does appeal to me about this is almost the sort of like, you can almost sense the Darwinian, Newtonian thinking that's gone into this unification of forces in time, as though you could apply a mathematical formula to this, with a sort of linear equation against time and some other sort of abstract factors. And I think it's more of a sign of the times. But again, these are not extensive thesis on certain things, and I think that's one of the things that I find with a lot of modern literature, is that they'll have a thesis or a project or a report or a paper, and it could be, maybe 20 pages, maybe 100 pages, but it's too long. This one is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's quite long. It's 5 pages. But there's these modern papers would be maybe 20 pages, which is 4 times as long. But it would have lots of really high-end, complex mathematical equations that you just wouldn't understand using integral calculus and summation and series and things that are just sort of you don't want to spend 2 weeks catching up on your algebra or your maths just to understand what these pictures are supposed to be. And so admittedly they're probably aimed at a high level audience, but it just makes the reading fairly difficult and essentially impossible, and not any particular use or application. Whereas I think that these older texts, they're actually designed for human communication. The strategic reserve, and again, the strategic reserve, I'm looking forward to that chapter as well. It's something that I've always tried to sort of play into when I do a scenario, it's to sort of think, well, okay, we're going to move these here, we're going to move something here and something here, and I'm going to leave this in reserve to see what happens. Now, as it happens here, these are all both on the Indian side anyway, so these are all in their own, you know, they're all together. But we might sort of, oh, I don't know, let's go into the play mode. You know, might send some forces this way, for example, and some forces this way because we want to cut across this bridge. But then we might say, well, okay, we're going to leave some forces in reserve here. We're going to leave a third in reserve there, so we can go this way or this way, depending on what happens. And I mean, you know, a lot of this isn't magical, but when people play games, they tend to sort of just send everyone to the front without putting in a reserve, and that builds onto the other thing that, again, I'm quite keen on the concept of role-playing in all of this. Is what you'll often find out is that people will just start moving their troops straight off, and I quite often try to, you know, in my thinking, to really make note of the fact that I might not want to move all my forces straight off. I might want to spend first 4 turns just doing artillery strikes, or I might want to move. I might say, okay, in my first turn, my objective is to form a line along there and a line there, for example. I mean, these are just 2 completely random examples. Let's just maybe do that again, so I've got a clearer. So I can say there and there, and then from there, when I've done that, I will then review what I want to do, because I've decided to do it that way. And it could be that when I've got to these positions, these forces have, instead of moving there as I might have imagined, they've moved all the way down here with these and created a much larger force. Now I might want to sit there and just sit there, and now this is the second part of what I'm talking about on all of this. I might then want to say, then I'm going to fall back to this line for some reason. I'm actually going to fall back. I haven't even done my assault, in the hope that they'll cross this river and they'll advance onto me. Now these are sort of things that just don't happen in war games, because there's this prerogative of just moving forward and, oh, I'm going to move all these and I'm going to do this and I'm just going to get that attack. And that's how war games sort of work. But, you know, I keep trying to force myself, when I do the videos, into sort of creating a sort of war game where I move up, and then if I get hit once, I fall back and then regroup. And these are sorts of things that happen in history, and, you know, I might like to, you know, try and sort of get some more examples of that, either through bad leadership, bad strategy, or either through clever decision making. You know, drawing units out to extend their, you know, lines of supply, or being able to then sort of, you know, rapidly cut them off as they advance down here, rapidly cut this river off, and then to sort of isolate, you know, and keep the battle here as opposed to here. In the you know, the understanding that any reinforcements that come down will be blocked at the river instead of us being blocked on the other side of the river. Just simple little things like that. But this is, you know, all brought to life through just the title, the strategic reserve. And in war games, you tend not to really get people applying a strategic reserve. And I think, you know, in a lot of these games, you should have as like a mentor or some sort of umpire that is there to sort of, you know, to award points to your performance based on what happened, and not sort of points on a, you know, victory points. Because I mean, basically, in a game, I mean, a lot of games they'll have victory points, and I really don't like those. Sometimes they work in the best of situations. They do work, and you can see the reason for them. But in the majority of situations, they're actually just an element of what's called gamification. And I know that's ironic to say we can't have gamification in games, but gamification is where you just take things and then you apply a gamification principle to it in order to make people want to achieve things. And gamification is sort of something that people will do in business. So people might, you know, the little sort of green shield stamps or the savings stamps that you get at supermarkets years ago are sort of part of that. You look forward to going shopping so that you can save another few points. And I have that at supermarkets these days. You get, you know, your loyalty cards, and it's the gamification of shopping. You're just wanting to get more and more points, even though really the points aren't actually worth that much. Generally, the supermarket I go to, they're 1% of whatever I spend, which you think, oh, 1%, well, that's like a 1% interest rate, or, you know, but at the end of the day, it's not really worth a lot. But the way it works, it gamifies things and it incentivizes you, and that's why they do it. And awarding victory points in games, it distorts the reality of the situation, which is often a changing dynamic, which requires you to constantly shift what you're doing, and to such an extent that although you might lose the victory points, you might have achieved a really clever strategy that achieved things that, because of, say, something that was unexpected, an unexpected devastation or a sudden loss, that you pulled tragedy from, certain defeat in a certain regard or a certain way, that when you look at it from a victory point perspective is a total failure. But an umpire would say, well, this was really well played because under these circumstances, when such and such happened, you did really well. And again, that's one thing I'd like to sort of see, but I think people can actually play that and then sort of, reiterate that. Now, a lot of these games, there's not a lot of scope for that, but this concept of the strategic reserve is certainly part of it. Using units in reserve and playing with reserves. Economy of force. I don't know what that's going to be about. The geometrical factor. Suspension of action in war. Again, it sounds like another Newtonian sort of philosophy, really. You half expect an equation to be present with that. But again, the suspension of action in war. Now, I don't know what that quite means, but it comes into play with regards to sort of, what I was just saying there. Let's maybe just pick up another completely random map to twiddle with. I don't know how this one can apply to that, but obviously these are the Houthi forces coming down and attacking these Hadi forces. They could come down here, attack here, and then at some point pull back. If they were not advancing as quickly as they want. Going off not so much, that's not a particularly strong point of what I'm trying to convey here, but on the topic of suspension of action in war, there's no incentive for that in a lot of war games, and I'm not just talking about sort of trying to extend things into a campaign level. What I think again in the game, what I keep sort of trying to sort of communicate is that there's a definite sense of loss of movement as a factor, and I think maybe that might have been something that was more historic. But for example, I know from my studies of things like the American Civil War, a lot of what actually happened were troops, generals moving their troops around into positions and then responding to what the other generals did, moving along rivers. They weren't engaging because they hadn't felt that they'd got the upper hand, constantly sort of readjusting their positions, sometimes travelling hundreds of miles across the country, which is, I think, pretty much what happened with the build-up to Gettysburg. And all of a sudden, one side decides that they see an opportunity and they really try and go for it. And that's what happened with a lot of those sorts of wars, and I think that's what happens with a lot of other wars. So you could sort of say, well, here, why do we need to just attack straight away? Why can't we just sort of suddenly move our forces? And I've said this I think in the last video. I'd like to see games where you don't actually do any of the fighting. For example, this would be a good one. As an example, you could say, I'm going to move here, here, I'm going to move into here. It's very clear that I can attack these units. So you don't attack them, but the next turn the FSA player says, well, it's quite clear that they can attack my units, so I'm going to move back. And so they move into this space here, they move these units back. And basically it's just a movement game without any combat, because both sides realise that they've manoeuvred, they both understand that if the other side is forced and has no choice to engage, both sides are going to lose, but you're going to be the loser clearly, and so it's easier to withdraw. But again, it's more of a cat and mouse, because you might be looking for an opportunity. They might move too much down this way and leave a space open here. The forces could become more concentrated in with a smaller line, etc. So all of that, it all just sort of springs to mind as all the elements that make strategy and these types of war games interesting. The character of contemporary warfare, that's going to be a good one, because I've already mentioned warfare. Contemporary warfare is going to be nothing like the warfare that Clausewitz is going to be referring to. I mean, Clausewitz himself had predicted in 1804 that if Napoleon ever invaded Russia, he would be defeated. Well, that's over 200 years ago that he made that prediction. I shouldn't be reading things out because I don't want to spoil it. Tension and rest, and again, the dynamic law in war. We've talked a little bit about that, or touched on that, and it's probably the same thing, but the suspension of action in war. I'm pretty sure that's got to have some sort of, based on the tension and rest concepts that we're going to cover here. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. But again, tension and rest is probably a similar thing to sort of, pushing troops forward and then a response, and then both sides not so much resting but regrouping and reassessing where they are. Similar to that India-Pakistan one that I just showed. You could move forward and then reassess and then pull back. You could pull back after one attack where you didn't do so well and recover or regroup. You could pull back and let your reserves take the front line and whatever. I mean, but the concept of tension and rest, it's not something that I've ever really heard any war game, I haven't really delved into too much, ever really sort of deal with. And the dynamic law in war. I mean, is that going to be particularly significant in contemporary warfare? I mean, when we get to there, we'll cover it. But I think all of these things are just bringing out new elements in the study of what Warblug is sort of pretty much based on. And I mean, this book, Modern Military Thought, it's a fantastic collection, and this is just one of many readings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm pretty sure I'll be able to find a few more. And one minute, I've got another one here that I just looked at. I mean, I've got a ton of books. I've got journals, I've got textbooks, I've got traditional books, I've got academic books. But this is another one, and this is by the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, September 1983, Combat Studies Institute, which is the same one that we're reading from there. This one is pretty much all. It's actually the same format. I've also just photocopied a lot of stuff. It's reference books, selected readings in military history, evolution of combined arms warfare. But I've got other ones. I can't find it, but particularly interesting because they have maps and things, and they're relatively modern. Essentially, I think there's a lot to be gained from reading, and it is the element of reading that I've always wanted to incorporate into Warblog. It's one of the things I first said, that the maps will be there, but it's the intention is that you would then go to the source, in this case South Front, but in a lot of cases Wikipedia, in a lot of cases actually dedicated sites on the subject, newspaper clippings. Essentially do your own research into what's what, and then after having read about something, come back and see how the map fits in with all of that. I think that's pretty much sort of where it's coming from. So I don't want to do too much reading, but I certainly think that it's going to add another sort of interesting dimension. And one of the reasons I'm doing them is because I can add them to playlists, and hopefully you can read, then you can listen to the whole thing with the added sort of Warblog commentary, on top of that. So anyway, that's that chapter. That was one of the shortest chapters ever, but we've managed to make it go to 40 minutes because of my endless babbling, so to speak. But obviously in the longer chapters I won't be able to babble as much. But hopefully you found that interesting, and stay tuned for the next one.